I hadn't been back to the mansion in almost 2 years. Business overseas kept dragging on longer than expected, and honestly, the place was supposed to be untouched, locked, monitored, and sitting quietly behind its iron gates like it always had. So when my driver slowed at the entrance and I noticed the gate already open, my first thought wasn't panic. It was confusion. That gate required a code, a physical key, and biometric access. No one was supposed to be there. Yet the driveway lights were on, the fountain was running, and worst of all, someone had parked their SUV in front of my garage like they owned the place. I stepped out of the car just as the front door flew open. A woman in her late 40s stormed onto the porch, clipboard in hand, HOA badge swinging from her neck like a badge of authority. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't hesitate. She pointed straight at me and yelled that I was trespassing on private HOA-controlled property. According to her, the mansion had been abandoned, reassigned under emergency HOA stewardship, and was now being occupied for community purposes. I almost laughed, until she pulled out her phone and announced she was calling the police on me. She paced back and forth as she spoke loudly into the phone, making sure the neighbors watching from across the street could hear every word. She said an unknown man had shown up, claiming ownership, refusing to leave, and acting aggressively. All lies. I stood there silently, letting her dig her hole deeper. When she hung up, she smirked and told me I'd better start apologizing now, because once the cops arrived, I'd be removed for breaking and entering. According to her, the HOA had paperwork proving everything. As we waited, I took in the details. My furniture was inside, asterisk but rearranged star. The art on the walls had been swapped. My office lights were on. Someone had been living there. Comfortably. Confidently. This wasn't a temporary squat. This was occupation. When I calmly asked how long she'd been staying there, she corrected me sharply. She wasn't staying. She was residing. The HOA president, she explained, had approved it after determining the home was unused and better serve the community with someone overseeing it full-time. The police arrived faster than I expected. 2 squad cars, lights flashing. She immediately ran toward them, crying about how unsafe she felt and how I'd shown up unannounced. One officer turned to me and asked for my ID. I handed it over, along with something else. The deed. Original. Not a copy. Not a scan. The same document that had been recorded with the county years before the HOA even existed. The officer's expression changed instantly. He looked at the address, looked back at the house, then looked at her. And that's when the question that shattered her confidence landed like a hammer. "Ma'am, why are you inside his house?" The officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply repeated the question, slowly this time, while holding my deed in his hand. The HOA Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like she was recalculating the situation in real time. She insisted the HOA had authorization, that the mansion had been unoccupied long enough to qualify for community oversight. She even claimed the board had a clause allowing them to secure and utilize abandoned properties. The second officer asked to see that paperwork. Her confidence returned instantly. She marched inside and came back waving a thick folder like it was a winning hand. What she handed over looked official at a glance. HOA letterhead, signatures, stamps, but the first officer flipped through it carefully. He asked a few simple questions. Was this recorded with the county?
No.
Did it include the owner's consent?
No.
Did it transfer ownership or tenancy rights? Absolutely not. With every page turn, her tone shifted from smug to defensive. She started talking faster, louder, insisting the HOA had always handled things this way, and that everyone knew the mansion was basically theirs since it sat inside the neighborhood gates. That's when I spoke up and calmly asked the officer to check the address against county records. He stepped aside, radioed in, and within minutes got confirmation. The property wasn't HOA owned. It wasn't HOA managed. It wasn't even subject to HOA authority. The mansion predated the association, sat on a separately deeded parcel, and had never signed HOA covenants. The silence that followed was deafening. The HOA Karen's face went pale. She tried to recover by claiming she was just keeping an eye on things, and that she only stayed there to prevent vandalism. But the truth unraveled fast. One officer asked why her personal belongings were inside: clothes, electronics, mail. Another asked why utilities were in her name. When confronted, she snapped. She accused me of trying to intimidate her, claimed the HOA board would deal with me legally, and demanded the officers remove me for causing a disturbance. That was the moment the lead officer cut her off. He told her to step back and informed her she may be unlawfully occupying private property. Then came the knock on the door, from my security company. I'd called them quietly when things escalated. They arrived with access logs showing the gate code had been changed without my authorization and cameras had been disabled from inside the house. The officers exchanged looks. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was trespassing. Possibly worse. The HOA Karen started shaking, insisting the board president told her it was allowed, that she was just following orders. The officer turned to her and said words she clearly wasn't prepared to hear. "Ma'am, you need to gather your essentials. You are not permitted to stay here tonight." Her voice cracked as she argued, but it didn't matter. She was escorted back inside, to pack. Neighbors who had gathered expecting me to be removed now watched her being walked out instead. As she passed me, she hissed that the HOA would destroy me for this. I didn't respond, because I already knew what she didn't. This was just the beginning, and the HOA had no idea what they'd stepped into. The HOA Karen left that night with 2 duffel bags and a look of disbelief that never quite faded. But she didn't leave quietly. As she walked past the officers, she made sure to announce, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, that this wasn't over, that the HOA president had authorized everything, and that I'd be hearing from their attorneys by morning. One officer didn't react at all. He simply reached up and tapped the small camera on his chest, reminding her that every word she said was being recorded. That's when she stopped talking. By the next morning, the bodycam footage was already circulating. Someone had requested it. Someone had shared it. The clip showed her confidently calling the police on me, claiming the property belonged to the HOA, admitting on camera that she had been living there for months, and insisting she had the right to occupy the mansion without my consent. Neighbors who'd watched the scene unfold the night before suddenly recognized the furniture in the background, the cars in the driveway, the mail deliveries. It became impossible to pretend this was a misunderstanding. Then the neighbors started talking, really talking. One by one, they came forward to the officers and later to the city. They explained how the HOA Karen had been using the mansion as her temporary residence, hosting board meetings inside, throwing gatherings, even warning residents not to question it because the HOA handled everything. One neighbor admitted he'd been fined for asking why she was living there. Another said she threatened enforcement action if anyone mentioned my name. The narrative flipped overnight, from HOA enforcing rules to HOA abusing power. That afternoon, I received an email from the HOA's legal counsel. The tone was completely different from the threats she'd made the night before. They apologized for the confusion and claimed the board had acted in good faith based on incorrect information. They asked if I'd be willing to resolve the matter privately. I forwarded the email directly to my attorney and to the city's property compliance office. Because while they were trying to contain damage, the investigation had already expanded beyond them. Inspectors arrived the next day. They documented unauthorized modifications inside the mansion, altered locks, disabled cameras, and unpermitted electrical changes. The utilities department flagged the illegal account transfers. The police reclassified the incident from a civil dispute to a criminal trespass investigation. And worst of all for the HOA, the officers confirmed the board president's name had come up repeatedly as the person who approved everything. That wasn't a rumor anymore. It was on record. By evening, the HOA Karen's confidence was gone entirely. She sent me a message, no longer threatening, no longer loud, begging me not to ruin her life over a misunderstanding. She claimed she trusted the board, that she believed the mansion was allowed to be used, that she never meant harm. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because this was no longer between her and me. This had become a matter of public record. And the HOA board was about to discover that when abuse of authority is exposed on camera, there's no closed-door meeting that can make it disappear. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled less than 48 hours after the bodycam footage went public. Normally those meetings were closed, guarded by vague agendas and homeowners-only language. This time, the parking lot was full before it even started. Neighbors who'd never attended a single HOA meeting in years showed up with printed copies of the footage, screenshots of emails, and one question they all wanted answered. Who approved living in someone else's mansion? Inside, the atmosphere collapsed almost immediately. The board president opened with a rehearsed statement about temporary oversight and community protection, but it didn't survive the first interruption. A homeowner stood up and demanded to know why HOA funds had been used to pay utilities at a private residence. Another asked why security logs had been altered. A third wanted to know why people were fined for asking questions. Every answer sounded weaker than the last, and every excuse pointed back to the same person, the president. That's when the board members started distancing themselves. One by one, they claimed they'd never voted on allowing anyone to live in the mansion. Another said the decision was presented as emergency property monitoring, not full-time residents. Someone else admitted they'd been pressured to stay quiet for the good of the HOA. The Karen who'd lived in my house sat in the back row, silent now, eyes fixed on the floor. The confidence she once had was completely gone. She wasn't a leader anymore. She was a liability. Midway through the meeting, a city official walked in unannounced. Then another. Then a representative from the county property office. The room went dead quiet. They weren't there to listen. They were there to inform the board that an official investigation had been opened into unauthorized property use, misuse of HOA authority, and potential fraud. The president tried to object, claiming the HOA was a private entity. The city official shut that down instantly. Private or not, trespass and misrepresentation weren't protected by HOA bylaws. By the end of the night, the board president resigned. Not formally, there wasn't even a vote. He simply stood up, said nothing, and walked out while half the room stared in silence and the other half applauded. 2 board members followed shortly after. The HOA's attorney left as well, citing a conflict of interest. What had started as an attempt to control the narrative turned into a public collapse. Outside, neighbors gathered in small groups, talking openly for the first time about fines, threats, and intimidation they'd dealt with for years. Several told me they'd already contacted lawyers. Others said they were requesting audits. The HOA Karen avoided eye contact as she slipped away, no longer protected by the board that had encouraged her actions. The power structure that once made her bold was gone. As I walked back through the gates of my reclaimed property, I realized something important. The HOA hadn't just lost control of my mansion. They'd lost control of everything. And Part 5 was going to make that permanent. The morning after the board's collapse, I stepped onto the front porch of my mansion feeling a strange mix of relief and vindication. Every room had been documented, every utility restored, and every lock replaced. The HOA Karen had been escorted out with nothing but her duffel bags. The neighborhood watched quietly as the gates swung shut behind me, not because they feared the HOA, but because they finally recognized who truly owned the place. By midweek, the consequences for the HOA were official. City inspectors fined the board for unauthorized property use and falsified records. County officials flagged the HOA's filings, demanding a full audit of their finances and property claims. Emails from residents flooded the HOA's legal counsel, each one demanding accountability for years of harassment and unlawful fines. Every document the HOA Karen had waved around as proof had been exposed as fraudulent, and the so-called board president was facing potential legal action for misrepresentation. The HOA Karen tried to recover her reputation. She emailed neighbors, sent letters, even called a few homeowners personally. But the footage, the witnesses, and the official investigations had already rewritten the narrative. Her threats fell on deaf ears. Residents who had once whispered about her boldness now openly questioned her judgment. The HOA had inadvertently trained its own victims to recognize abuse, and there was no going back. Within a month, the mansion had become more than a reclaimed home, it was a symbol. Neighbors began using it as a hub for community transparency, meetings, garden days, and neighborhood improvement projects. What had started as a confrontation over ownership transformed into a rallying point against unchecked authority. The HOA Karen, once a figure of intimidation, faded from local memory. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered among residents and shared in private HOA forums as a lesson in overreach. As I finally sat in my restored office, overlooking the gardens and fountains, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The mansion was mine, not just in title, but in respect, authority, and history. The HOA had attempted to rewrite the rules, to assert control without legitimacy, and had failed spectacularly. In the end, truth, law, and patience had restored not just my property, but the principle that power without accountability is temporary. And from that moment, every person in the neighborhood knew. My mansion, my rules, and justice had been served.